Hello, dear listener. Welcome to my channel, where stories are so scary that only the bravest and most fearless can listen. If you are sure that you are brave enough, subscribe to my channel and I will question your bravery. But before you do, let me warn you, these stories are not for the faint of heart. They are not for people who scare easily. They are for people with ice in their veins and darkness in their hearts. If you are one of those people, then I welcome you. Come closer, listen closely, and prepare yourself for the horror that awaits. I'm a 23-year-old female, and this happened to me about 3 years ago. One day, I was driving from college to my house, which is like an hour drive. I just got on the highway and saw a man, maybe in his mid-50s, in a white car, just tapping on his steering wheel. I thought nothing of it. Then he started tailgating me, and I thought it was weird, but I kept on driving. All of a sudden, he changed lanes, speeds up to pass me, and he goes back to the lane I was. That's when I realized he was following me and trying to make me stop. So I passed and ignored him, but he kept doing the same thing. I was scared because I still had a 40-minute drive to my home, and it was the first time that this had happened to me. So I kept ignoring him until he changed lanes and kept on my side. Then he started hand gesturing, saying that I should roll my window down. I said, for what? And he asked if I could stop because I had a flat tire. I knew when my car has a flat tire, and I didn't have one, so I said no. And then he changed his story and said, I only want your cell phone number, and I kept saying no. I sped up, and he kept following me. I was very scared, but fortunately there was a police car, and the man just stopped following me and took the nearest exit. When I got home, I had told my mom what happened, and she started freaking out. I didn't know why. I was stunned to what she told me next. And she said that she had read a news article the other day of a man that goes after young women and uses that same highway to get his victims to stop because there's something wrong with their car. When they stop, he stops to help, and instead assaults them on the spot. I was surprised and very scared. I don't know if he ever got caught. I looked for news articles, but never found one that confirmed that he was apprehended. I've had quite a few experiences with the paranormal, but most of my encounters tend to circulate around my grandmother's house that she bought in 1986. I did some research on the address, and I was only able to find one incident that hadn't even occurred on the property. There was a really sharp turn at the end of the road. Supposedly, a man on a motorcycle had crashed and died in a close neighbor's arms. I have considered asking her about this event, but my grandmother said that it may be too traumatic to make her recall. When I was 4 years old, I apparently told my mother that I wanted to go to Granny's house so that I could play with my friend. When my mother asked me about this friend, I told her that he was the bloody boy on the bike. My mother wouldn't take me back to Granny's for a while after that. I had no recollection of this boy. As I grew older, spending the weekend at my grandmother's house became a regular thing. My twin and I would stay up late to listen to the noises that would sound through the house at night. My grandmother had some antique chairs in the dining room that would squeak if you put weight on them. This would be one of the noises we would hear. My grandmother would always blame the squeaking on her sumo wrestler-sized Siamese cat. Sadly, the cat developed cancer and had to be put down. The night that he was put down, we, now teenage twins, stayed with our grandmother since she was an utter mess. That cat was like a child. Our grandmother was asleep in her bed, and we were staring at our phones in the living room when we began to hear the creaking of the chairs. My sister and I looked at each other with mouths agape. We both knew that the cat was no longer the culprit, so we covered our heads in our blankets. I had a really hard time sleeping that night. The next event occurred when I was about 17. Again, my sister and I were spending the night at our grandmother's house. I had woken up at about 1 in the morning. I groggily looked over to my right. Beside my head was a floating black ball that looked like static with less white light. It was like it was moving while staying in place. I was still trying to comprehend what I was seeing, so I reached over and almost touched it. Even in my confused state, I realized that I probably shouldn't touch it. I pulled my hand back and shut my eyes. It was then that I heard a blood-curdling scream, and there was a swift smack to my face. I sat up in a daze and noticed my sister was visibly angry. I asked her what happened. She stated that I had just started screaming, so to fix that, she had to smack me. I probably would have done the same in her position, so I don't hold a grudge. Due to some family issues, I moved out as soon as I turned 18. My grandmother wanted me to continue going to college properly, so she said that I could use her old sewing room until I finished my schooling. I was a bit worried due to my past experiences, but it was a really good offer. It was about 2 months after I moved in that things started to get scary. I was sleeping soundly in bed when my cat grabbed my hair in its mouth and proceeded to yank my head back. This was really strange behavior since my cat is an absolute love bug. He had never done anything like this before. I sat up on my stomach, crying out in pain. My cat then jumped off my back and out of the room very quickly. Awake and angry at my kitty alarm clock, I turned my head to see something huge standing in front of my dresser that had a mirror. A humanoid figure was standing there as if it were looking in the mirror. It looked as if it were made up of the same material as the ball that I had seen. I sat frozen in fear as I watched this thing turn slightly, and had just noticed that I was awake. The words, "It's a girl," and "run" crossed my mind at the moment its non-existent eyes met mine. I don't remember much of what happened next. When I came to, I was swelling my arms in the side of my grandmother's bed. I was in shock. Apparently, I had run screaming to the house from my grandmother, saying that there was someone in the room. Being a strong-willed Southern woman, my grandmother proceeded to pull out her pistol in order to go take on the intruder. I was finally able to process what had happened at this point. My grandmother yelled out for me when I began to make my way back to my room. I just couldn't believe it. I had to see it again for myself. However, the room was empty. I started shaking uncontrollably. What I saw was not human. My grandmother had me sleep with her that night, but we had to turn on the nightlight before sleep was even a thought. A very similar event took place a few months later, but it was not as chaotic. Again, I had awoken randomly. I looked over to the corner of my room and noticed something crouched down beside my computer chair. It started to stand up. It wasn't 2 seconds later that I blanked out again. My grandmother had told me not to scare her like that the first time, so this time I walked through the house, calling out to her, calmly dragging my blanket behind me. My uncle happened to hear me and intercept me before I got to her room. He told me to go back to bed. Being conscious again, I repeated my habit of peeking my head into my room to find the figure. It was the same result. I slept with my light on for 3 days after that. I am terrified of having another experience like the ones I have encountered. I know it is strange, but I now sleep with 2 lamps on at all times. It has been about 2 years since I saw those forms, and I still cannot explain them. I thought I was doing well until just recently. 2 weeks ago, I had gone to sleep with earbuds in. I sometimes listen to ASMR to put me to sleep. When I awoke, it was still playing in my ears. It was the sound of someone typing on a keyboard. I was gonna pull them out of my ear, but I realized that I couldn't move. I had heard of sleep paralysis before, but this was my first time experiencing it. I noticed that the sound in my ears was getting louder. It was almost deafening, and as it did, I began to hear what sounded like laughter. It was a strong male voice. I had listened to this ASMR before and had no recollection of such sounds. I was freaking out. I desperately began trying to lift up my left leg. It wouldn't budge. When I regained my freedom a few moments later, I ripped the earbud out and let the tears roll. It was pretty early in the morning, so I covered my face with my blanket and cried myself to sleep. I don't know what is wrong with me. I've heard some say that it could be nightmares, and others say something is attached to me. I just know that all of these events were extremely vivid. I do believe in the paranormal to an extent, but I still tend to lean towards more reasonable reasons. Any answers would be pretty amazing, and I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe with some help, I will be able to sleep in the dark again. To start up this post, I'd just like to say that I am a Christian. I believe in God and angels, but I also believe in Satan and demons. I truly believe that the night this happened, I came into contact with a demon. I was getting ready for bed one night in the fall of 2018 when I had a really bad pain in my side. This came out of nowhere and it caused me to have to sit down. I began seeing stars, and that's the last thing I remember until I woke up. It felt like something was pinning me down to my bed, sitting on my stomach and holding both my hands down. I started screaming and the thing was gone. Just like that. I ran in my parents' room sobbing and told them what had happened. I believe this happened because I was having a very good night spiritually, and Satan didn't like that. I prayed over my room and our house and fell asleep. Nothing like this has happened since. I never realized how affected I was by the situation until I recently moved back in with my parents. I sleep in the basement of their bungalow. We're surrounded by trees, and the house is in the middle of a clearing. It gets eerily dark at night, making it hard to see out of the windows, whether the room is dark or light. Therefore, it plunged the rest of the basement into complete darkness. I'm always afraid I'm going to look out the window, which has no blinds, by the way, and see a figure outlined by the dim light of the moon, or open my door to someone standing in the dark exercise space across from me. The event that sparked this fear is where my terrifying story begins. I lived with my boyfriend, ex now, for about 6 months before we broke up. We lived with 5 other people, 4 of us upstairs, 3 downstairs. The house was one of those old brick bungalow houses that you'd picture an older couple living in. It was converted into basically all rooms. The living room at the front of the house and the den in the back right corner were converted into rooms. Basements don't really matter as it's not a part of the story. To understand, however, you need to know the layout of the main floor. As I said earlier, the living room was in the front left of the house. Mine and my boyfriend's room was on the front right. We shared a wall with the back right roommate, and he shared a wall with the bathroom, which was semi-across/diagonal from our bedroom door. The kitchen was in the back left side where our back door was, which was never, ever locked. We lived in the neighborhood of university kids and elderly people, so we never thought it would be an issue. Unfortunately, homelessness and hard drugs were also rampant in our town, and as most do, I never thought we'd be targeted. My job at the time was very physical and required me to drink lots of water, so I was often up multiple times a night going to the washroom. This night was no different. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I got up, an important detail in which I didn't know until later. Usually I checked the time on my phone to see if I could catch some more Z's before getting ready for work. But knowing it was Saturday and I didn't have to work, I didn't bother with checking. In my just woke up haze, I stumbled my way through our bedroom. I'm not sure why, but my body was telling me it was around 6:30 to 7 a.m., meaning my boyfriend, who didn't work weekends, would be waking up soon. As I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, I heard my boyfriend sleepily say, "Hello," in his phone call voice, so I knew he wasn't talking to me. However, for a split second, I thought that the voice came from somewhere in the kitchen, and it almost caused me to step back into the room and close the door. But the feeling slowly passed as I stared into our dark house and came to the ultimate conclusion it was in fact my boyfriend's voice from within the bedroom. Along with keeping our back door unlocked, we usually always kept the kitchen light on. Roommates were in and out at all hours of the night, so it just made it easier for them to make less noise when they got home. But this morning was different, and the house was completely black. Out of habit, I looked at both roommates' doors. No light was emanating out of the crack at the bottom, so I knew that they were both asleep. Nosy, I know. I made the quick 3 steps to the washroom and closed and locked the door. As I was sitting there, my mind started to wake up more, and I began thinking about that voice that I heard, and how it didn't quite sound like my boyfriend. And how, up until now, I realized I never heard his phone ring. My thoughts were quickly cut off when I heard footsteps in the kitchen moving around, then coming over to the bathroom, then towards the back door. Oh, it's just James, leaving for work, I thought. He would often come to the bathroom door to see if anyone was there, as the door was 8 times out of 10 closed. So this reassured me if it was him, he'd just go to the washroom at work. I kind of relaxed and went back to assuming the voice I heard was in fact my boyfriend, and the phone call that he got was from his boss saying he was late. But something still didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake that sinking feeling in my stomach. I think my brain was trying to keep me calm, knowing I'd have to take those 3 dreaded steps into the unknown before I was back behind the closed door. I stalled for a couple of minutes. I hadn't heard anything else from the kitchen, so I figured, worst case scenario, if it was someone, they were gone by now. I was still in a sleepy haze and tried chalking up the sounds to my state. I opened up the bathroom door and without success, stared into the darkness of our kitchen to see if I could see anything. Of course, I didn't. I quickly rushed into our room, closed and locked the door, and turned towards the bed. My heart sunk. There was my boyfriend, snoring the same as I left him, clearly not having woken up yet. Still thinking, and hoping the voice I heard was his, I shook him, thinking he'd wake up easily as I was in the washroom for no longer than 5 minutes, so he couldn't possibly have been in that deep of a sleep yet. It took a minute to wake him up, but he groggily says, "What?" Clearly annoyed that I had just woken him. "Who's on the phone? Don't you have to leave for work?" I said. "What?" He mumbled again. A little more awake this time, he reached over and clicked his phone's home button, lighting up the room a bit. I paid no attention to the screen. I knew he heard me, and he was confirming my suspicions that someone was in our house that wasn't supposed to be. I tried again, however, hoping to get a response I wanted. "Just a couple of minutes ago, I heard you as I left for the washroom. You said, 'Hello.' Was it your boss?" He made a sort of angry grunt and rolled over in bed away from me. "No one called me, babe. It's 4:30 in the morning. Go back to bed." Although it wasn't loud, I was screaming as the events from the last 5 minutes crashed over me in a new light, and I was suddenly the most awake I think I've ever been. "James, someone's in the house." I heard a male voice say hello. "Are you listening to me? There's someone in the house." We argued back and forth, him saying it was a roommate. I imagined it, any excuse he could make. He quickly fell back asleep after telling me once again to go back to bed. I stood next to my boyfriend, realization that the voice I heard wasn't his, that it was in the kitchen, as per my original split-second thought, and that the footsteps weren't his. My next memory of the event gripped my heart, and I almost sunk to the floor in fear. I never heard a door open or close during the entirety of this event. He, or it, was still in the house. Maybe it was a roommate, I thought to myself. No, I didn't hear any of their doors close. And besides, they all knew I lived there and what I looked like. They've had plenty of opportunities to talk to me and haven't, so they wouldn't pick 4:30 a.m. in the pitch black after seeing me exit a room to do it. Maybe a guest. I checked outside our window and saw our one roommate, who would have guessed was gone for the night. He often was. And our other roommate was kind of a nerd, and I never saw or heard anyone in or out of this room, not even family. The downstairs roommates have their own kitchen, so there will be no need for them to be in our kitchen. And the only time I've ever seen them upstairs was to ask for our landlord's number after he locked himself out of this room. So it was decided someone was in our house. I'll blame what happens next on my brain for the second time, trying to lull me into a false sense of security. It's a ghost, I thought. I'm not sure why a ghost would be better than a human. Maybe because ghosts can't really hurt you, which after reading these threads and listening to the podcast, I know was dumb of me to think. And a human could do physical harm to us. Maybe they were more dangerous. I imagined it was my next attempt at making myself feel better. But I know, I know that I heard a male's voice clear as day say hello. I took a look at my boyfriend and realized that if someone was in our house, he wouldn't let anything happen to me, nor would the multiple knives that he kept at his bedside table either. I woke up a couple of hours later to my boyfriend's alarm. I sat up in bed as he got ready and told him the events that had occurred earlier. He, of course, brushed it off and said it was probably one of our roommates. I didn't keep pushing for him to believe me, which was a factor in us breaking up. I had hoped he'd been too delirious when I woke him up early and would say, "Oh yeah, it was for me," but it never came. It's now almost April 26th, and I have such a crippling fear of being broken into or having someone watching me that it's affected my sleep in a very negative way. I can feel myself slowly losing grip of my paranoia, which is perfect timing. My parents are going abroad for 3 weeks on May 1st, leaving me alone in this big house in the forest with just my thoughts to keep me company. It's 2 a.m. and my teeth had fallen out again. My tongue examines the craters along my gum, and I pray to find out what was once there. My tongue proves one thing to be true. Every tooth that once rooted itself above my neck and under my nose has escaped me. Salt-filled streams of embarrassment and disbelief move in landslides down my rose-tinted cheeks. My eyes reluctantly glance down to view the contents of my right hand. It seems as if the amount of teeth I hold could cause the tooth fairy to become bankrupt. Every molar, cuspid, bicuspid, and lateral in my hand are no longer included as parts of my anatomy. They become objects. As fear takes possession of me, all that I desire is the comfort and love of my mother. The manifestation has become so intense that my emotions are now identical to that of a child who has lost their favorite toy. My mother suddenly appears in a surreal yet lifelike fashion. Seeing her face instantly creates a shortage upon the growing terror within me. She faces me and then realizes what had happened to my mouth. She realizes what has happened to her daughter. However, she appears to feel no fear or concern for my situation. As a matter of fact, she seemed almost baffled at the level of concern that I expressed for my teeth, which are non-existent in my mouth and instead in my trembling hands. "Haley, don't worry. Those teeth are meant to be temporary. You're supposed to lose those teeth. In fact, you'll grow a whole new set of teeth many times in your life. It's totally normal." A simmering rage mixed with disbelief and confusion bubbled within me. The dropping of my jaw and the narrowing of my eyebrows were almost instantaneous. How could my mother be so ignorant? How could she not understand what is happening to me is terrible and abnormal? Emotionally distraught and mentally drained, I belted her. "That can't be possible. Something is seriously wrong, Mom. Please listen to me." Then, with a blank visage and seemingly lifeless voice, she responds to me. "Just wait." A sensation emerges from my jaws, but it isn't painful. Brand new teeth are raised from beneath my gums in somewhat of a factory machine type way. Each tooth aligned with its neighboring teeth, filling the void amongst my gums, all the while appearing perfectly aligned. My mother was correct, but it doesn't change my fear and confusion towards the situation. Too many questions are left within my mind that I realize cannot be answered. My subconscious vessel begins to fade away at this moment, and I become conscious. My heavy eyelids begin to open. I stretch my hand out to grasp my phone in the haze of sleepy drunkenness to check the time. It's 6:15 a.m., and I realize that I've had a teeth dream again. I hate those dreams. I lie in bed and reflect upon the unpleasantries that emerged from my nighttime dreams. I think about similar dreams that I've had in the past. Like the time I had a dream that in between my teeth, there were pieces of human nails. Every time that I tried to pry the pieces of nails from the crevices of my gums, more nails would appear. Perhaps some of the most bizarre dreams I had were the ones where my teeth became loose, but they never fell out. The teeth kept themselves sewed to my gums, but they simply were loose and served no purpose. It's a rare thing for a pleasant dream to occur while I sleep, if not a thing of the past. I said my goodbye to sweet dreams when I became diagnosed with depression and started taking antidepressants at the age of 15. I was prescribed a white and navy blue antidepressant known as Prozac. As I held the pill bottle in my hand, I felt hope for the first time in years that I would be happy again. And well, that hope eventually became reality. I felt the physical symptoms of sadness slowly lift off my chest every day. I started to feel alive instead of just purely living. I anticipated that feeling ever since I was a numb 12-year-old girl. That girl isn't numb anymore. As weeks progressed, I noticed drastic changes in my life. Some changes were blessings, other changes were curses. I felt as alive and happy as a clam, but that soon became a different story when I fell asleep each night. I soon would learn the side effects of antidepressants. The most prominent side effect for me would be bizarre and/or intense dreams. During most nights, I awoke gasping and praying to God that whatever I had experienced while I was sleeping was fake. What I experienced when I slept was surreal, vivid, and worst of all, violent. It felt like I was there, experiencing every trauma that my subconscious could imagine. On one notable night, I dreamt of a gunman shooting at my school. Every child ran as far and fast as I could away from the school in groups, but somehow the gunman just kept following, trying to slay every one of us. It was almost as if it was the Terminator. He was unstoppable. I became afraid to leave my bed when I awoke because my experience felt immensely real. One must understand why antidepressant users continue to deal with such horrific side effects. I could stop taking Prozac and just have decent dreams again, right? What some don't understand is, without the sacrifice of peaceful sleep, I would continue to live my days physically and emotionally numb. There would be no such thing as happiness if I didn't take that blue and white pill every day. Most people believe that once someone with depression is prescribed an antidepressant, they simply become happy and the rest is history. No one usually considers what the negative effects might be for those who take medication for mental illness. And because of this, I live my life trying to educate others around me about mental illness. It's 8 p.m. I had swallowed my happy pill, and in 2 hours I would start to fall asleep. I accept that torture from my subconscious vessel is drawing nigh. I've grown indifferent towards the consequences of sleep. I used to fear sleeping when I started using antidepressants. I didn't want to submit a part of myself to torture every night, but I became used to it. The more I've accepted that I will have nightmares, the stronger my subconscious and conscious vessels have become towards them. The horrific, violent, and intense dreams are worth my happiness. I understand that tonight I may run away from a gunman, I may be assaulted, or parts of my body will be taken from me. I understand that the level of fear in my dreams will be intense and vivid tonight, but I wouldn't trade it for feeling happiness when I'm awake. 2 hours have passed, and now I lay in my bed with my eyes growing tired. My eyelids relax, my consciousness slowly shuts down. I can only hope that my teeth don't fall out again. My name is Ethan, and I have worked at my local big-name burger place since I turned 16. It started as simply being a job to put gas in my car and buy video games, but before I realized it, I was 22 and the store's newest assistant manager. Even though now I'm 28 and the manager of 3 of the local franchise's restaurants, this tale will take place at the time I had just become the assistant manager of the one. So, like I said, I'm 22 and a brand new member of the management team. Although I've been working days for the last 5 years, my shifts would now be nights. It took a slight adjustment, especially in my sleep, to get used to the change, but not long after, I grew to prefer nights and the staff that came with them. My boss, the night manager, was a laid-back dude, and we were able to get away with most anything as long as we got our work done. He'd usually dip at about 11 to go see his girl and leave me to close the restaurant. Since we weren't one of the stores that stayed open past midnight, I didn't mind being on my own to run things. To be honest, we didn't often have many customers, if any, after he left. We tried to have most of the closing work done by then, so we could screw around until it was time to close up. I won't get too specific about our activities, but I will say there wasn't much work being done. The night shift I have in mind was nothing out of the ordinary. The boss left around 10:45. We would close the dining area at 10, and once he was happy that it was cleaned and restocked, he took off like usual. The rest of us split up to do our thing. Normally we would have 2 people take out the trash and 1 person stand at the door and watch. This was considered a safety measure to avoid letting a backdoor robber slip in when no one was watching. However, as you can probably guess, we weren't exactly sticklers for the rules, and we rarely did this. That night, Adam, or so we'll call him, was the team member that took out the trash just before it closed, and as far as I know, he saw no reason to be scared when he did it. He left the door open while he did this because it would automatically lock when shut, another of those safety measures. If you let it lock behind you, you'd be stuck outside and have to pound on it until someone inside decided to let you in. A universally hated situation. Like I said, the door was stuck open while he took the trash to the dumpster, and I just happened to be by the door checking on the mop or something. I'm not sure why I looked outside, but I noticed Adam running as fast as possible for the door. When he noticed I was watching, he began yelling. There's a dude in a mask running for the door. This took a second to compute, but when it did, I almost soiled myself. I knew what he was planning on doing, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. Luckily, Adam was halfway to the door when he saw the guy, and I was already ready to slam the thing shut once he got in. I was holding it only about halfway open and yelling at him to hurry because I could see that the dude in the mask was incredibly close. As Adam reached the door and jumped inside, the robber attempted to stick his foot and hand into the doorway to stop me from closing it. As I pulled it closed, I tried to make it so hard that the dude's foot and hand would be hurt, and he'd instinctively yank them back. He must have been tougher than I thought because despite slamming his body parts in the big steel door, he continued to yank his way in. By stomping on it, we managed to get him to yank back his foot pretty quickly, but his hand was still wedged in, and what I hadn't noticed before was the pistol waving around in it. I was terrified that he'd pull the trigger and hit one of us. So we let go of the door, but I guess he didn't think of it. But this time, 3 of the team, including me, were pulling on one small handle bolt to the door. I had initially thought that we would have the advantage, but at least I was getting exhausted, fighting to hold the door. As for him, the gap was getting wider and he was almost able to fit both of his arms in. To my relief, about that time, one of the girls grabbed the full coffee pot and poured the whole thing over his hand. He instantly started screaming, and despite not wanting to do so, he pulled both of his hands out of the doorway and the door slammed shut. It did so hard, 2 of us fell back onto the floor. During our melee, another employee had called the police. They must have arrived in record time, because I know the fight for the door hadn't lasted more than a minute and a half, and I could see them driving up as he ran past the drive-thru window. We all stood and watched as they cuffed him and pulled the mask from his face. We all gasped when we saw that he was actually, in fact, a former employee, Andre, who had been fired a few months before for showing up to work so drunk that he was unable to do his job. It made sense that it was a former employee. The thief knew we'd be slacking off and not paying attention. It would give him the best chance to get the money before I dropped it into the safe for the night. I opened the door and let in 2 of the officers. We sat in the dining area and talked about what had just happened. I did my best to relay the events, and once they finished with me, they talked to a few of the others that had seen the whole incident. After they got all the info they needed, they let us go. On my way home, I called my boss to inform him of the night's entertainment. Considering what occurred, we decided that in the future we should perhaps be somewhat more observant of the rules when it came to safety. We by no means wanted to take the fun out of the night shift, but it seemed wise to follow safety rules in order to hopefully prevent the near tragedy we'd almost had that night. And, at least for the rest of my time at that restaurant, we practiced the safety rules the way they were intended when they were written, but we still continued to have a good time in between. Andre ended up doing some time in jail. At least a year from what I've heard. He's doing more right now because of another robbery he did where the guy with him actually did shoot somebody. It's a strange thing to think back on. He's always seemed like a nice dude. I've moved up and on in the company since then and done my best to make my stores a fun but safe environment to work in. I probably have forgotten about the whole thing, but I just read about a fast food place not far from me being robbed and the manager being killed. Turned out to be the guy I knew from the first store I worked in. It reminded me how important it is to be safe and careful in our business. Always remember to watch your six and keep your head on the swivel. Good night, y'all, and keep safe. I've been urged by those close to me to share my account of a recent life-changing event I experienced while working drive-through window at my fast food job. Until this happened, I had yet to fall victim to the irrational anger some carry around all day inside of them. I was unaware of how easily they can be triggered, and now that I had seen it firsthand, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust another human again. Although, at this time, it is still very difficult for me to relive the event, I am encouraged that, to do so through this post, I may be able to begin to take charge of my life again. I guess I'll start at the beginning, in order to make what came next make more sense. My name is Zoe Marie, but my friends call me Zoe. I'm currently 17 and will soon graduate high school a year early because I was allowed to skip ahead a grade when I was younger. In order to instill a strong work ethic into their young daughter, my parents encouraged me to get a job once I had turned 16. Not being one that wanted to disappoint my parents, I soon found a part-time job at a chain burger and fries restaurant near my home. I would often ride my bike the 2 miles after school and work a few hours during the weekdays and longer shifts on weekend evenings. So I had always had all of my things paid for up until that time. Seeing each check filled me with a mixture of awe and achievement. These feelings appeared to have done exactly what my parents had hoped and fired my will to work even harder. I'm not sure if this desire spawned from a place of greed. I'm sure the argument could be made. Nonetheless, I did look forward to each shift. My shift that night had started at the counter, but once the girl working the window ended her shift, I was moved to her station. At the time, I had no preference between counter and window. You came into contact with the rude and crude working both, and this night was no different. I had already had a big fat woman with her 3 snotty-nosed children in tow scream at me for making a small mistake in her order. Perhaps the only benefit I did have was that I rarely worked after midnight, so I didn't have to deal with many intoxicated customers that came later. The 1 or 2 times I did work later, I found it a trying experience. I'll keep my moral views to myself. I will only say that I see those who partake of alcohol as weak, and I'll leave it at that. My shift was ending in around an hour when I met my last customer. From the way the gentleman was speaking, I could tell he had been drinking that evening. The transaction was a string of confusion and chaos. He changed the order multiple times, and those in the car with him sounded as confused as him. The entire mess came to a head when I informed him that our shake machine was out of order. I'm aware that most drive-thru workers will use that as an excuse, but I promised that night it was certainly broken. When I told him this, I was assaulted with a tirade of curses and derogatory names. And then he went silent. At first, I had believed that there was something amiss with the headset, but I was wrong. The quiet was shattered by the squealing of tires. The cry of the tires was almost instantly joined by the roar of gunfire. I still believe to this day the only thing that saved my life was the sound of the tires. When I heard them, I leaned a bit forward in the window, almost putting my head out of the doors. I had only expected an angry confrontation at that second, but coming face to face with the barrel of his gun as he extended his arm from his window, I instinctively ran for cover. The countless bangs from the gun and the screams of my fellow employees seemed to last a lifetime. No matter how I tried to drown them out by covering my head with my arms, they remained just as horrifying. I'm not sure when the firing finally stopped, but I didn't even consider raising my head until another of the employees shook me. I guess at the time he was checking to see if I had been struck by any of the bullets, but regardless of his intent, I hesitated a moment before I sat upright. To my dismay, two of the others working that night had been injured, and although neither of them died, I couldn't return to that restaurant or any of its kind for quite some time. Just now, over 6 months after this happened, can I finally see a business with a drive-through window without having a panic attack? In the months since the attack, I have spent a large amount of time and energy in counseling in the hopes of regaining my courage and ability to be a useful member of society again. Whether it's due to feelings of guilt or fear, the road has been a hard one, and if it were not for the sense of purpose and the hard work ethic my parents have helped foster in me, I may not have even made it through school. Despite my heartfelt hopes and many prayers, the police have yet to find or arrest the thugs that attempted to take my life because of a freaking shake machine. The best I can do is continue to have faith in law enforcement and the universal force of right. I know someday, some way, they will be made to pay for what they have done. The only real solace I can find is the fact that no one has lost their lives because of something I did or said. Working on and off part-time in the pizza delivery industry for the last 20 years, I can tell you a crazy story or two. Not all were experiences of my own, but they have all given me more than my share of bad dreams. One particular episode I went through, about 7 years ago, has stuck with me all these years, and I'm fairly certain I'll never be able to fully shake free from it. About a year before what I'm talking about went down, I had befriended a guy at work everyone called D. I wasn't sure at the time what his God-given name was, but that's the name everybody referred to him by, so that's what I used. D was about the same age as me and liked the same music as myself. He even managed to introduce me to a few bands I didn't know of, and I did the same for him. On occasional days off, we'd hit the clubs in search of the next great band, but more often than not, we just got blotto and head on chits. Something odd that I did notice was that he would occasionally get really aggressive towards girls that shot him down. I'd often find myself stuck in the middle of trying to de-escalate the situation and calm him down. Once he finally realized what he was doing, he'd laugh off his behavior. My initial opinion was that the aggression came along with alcohol consumption, but when he did the same thing before he'd even had a drink, it became clear that he had serious anger problems towards women, boiling just below the surface. Soon, this reoccurring behavior became too much for me, and I found myself inventing excuses not to go out with him, and I saw less and less of him outside of work. Despite this, we still got along well when we were there, so I had no reason to see him as anything other than a great guy I had always known. As time rolled on, D's performance at work started to suffer, and our out-of-work interactions all but ceased. Strangest of all, his attitude toward other people at work became cold, myself included. My attempts to make small talk about music and such were often met with disinterest or downright silence. I figured he was butthurt about me not wanting to chase tail with him anymore, so I left him to himself to deal with his issues with me rather than push him on the subject. It was no big deal anyway. I was working less at the restaurant and was becoming more focused on my business. D obviously was having some problems I wasn't aware of, and they were affecting his work. He would spend longer and longer on his deliveries until one day he never returned. It wasn't until my next shift, a few nights later, that I found out that he'd been arrested. The cops picked him up on his last delivery, and you'll never guess why. From rumors and the little information I got from the media, the cops grabbed him while he was attempting to break into an apartment. As the facts slowly seeped out, it appeared that D had been doing this a lot, usually while working. Not only was he breaking and entering places, he turned out to be a serial sexual offender that we'd had around the area for years. Apparently, the individual in question was allegedly supposed to have assaulted and killed at least 5 women, or possibly more, since he started. I had had a hard time believing this all at first, but as I began analyzing his behavior towards females when we went out, it started to make sense. From the testimony of others, I was apparently one of the few who actually got a peek behind his mask. At least at first, but as the months went on, the mask began to slip and he was unable to hide his true self from those around him. This is probably the reason why he became cold and distant to other people. He couldn't hide his real face any longer. I had moved on from that particular restaurant by the time the trial was about to start. He was only being charged for the attempted break-in and one assault and murder. The trial only lasted a few weeks before he pounced on the deal that he was offered. He managed to dodge the death penalty but still got nailed with a life sentence. He's currently rumored to be a model prisoner and lead guitar in the prison band. The authorities have made it clear that he isn't going to get away with any other crimes. In the future, when they have accumulated more evidence, they will go for the death penalty. Considering there's no statute of limitations on murder, I'm pretty sure they'll get it. I'd like to take advantage of this forum to share the story of the kindest and most beautiful woman I have ever had the privilege to set my eyes upon. Despite her difficult upbringing and sometimes violent living environment, Sofia Hernandez managed to hold on to her inherent kind nature and loving soul her whole life. Although I was only in her presence for a short time, the amazing way in which she touched my heart will endure with me for eternity. My first meeting with Sofia was when I took over as the manager of a local Tex-Mex fast food place across town. I had been the assistant of another franchise location the next town over, and this would be the first store I'd be running on my own. Sofia was the current assistant manager and had been at this particular location for several years. From the second I was introduced to her, she had me wrapped around her finger. The most amazing thing was that she had the power over everyone she met, male or female, and she didn't even know it. Nonetheless, I knew I'd have to keep our relationship totally professional because I would need her experience in order to learn the ropes of my new job and the individual personalities of each employee. Her guidance proved to be just as priceless as I had hoped. Many times, I would have surely have been reprimanded or fired if she hadn't been there to push me in the right direction. One of my greatest fears was that my bosses would discover exactly how clueless I was at the beginning and send me back to my previous store, thus separating us. It took a lot of hard work and guidance from Sofia, but I eventually got the hang of things. Since her job required us to work together most of the time, I naturally learned more and more about her life before I met her. Apparently, she'd grown up in the gang-infested hole just east of the tracks, and she fell in love with one of the gangs. Although she wasn't directly involved with the gang's activities, being someone that hung around with its members meant most of her friends were. She soon fell in love with one of the guys from the gang, and they had a daughter together. They never got married, but because of their mutual connection with the gang, most everyone thought of them as being so. Not long after the birth of their child, her boyfriend became violent toward her, often beating her badly. She stayed with him for several years until the violence reached a life-threatening level, and one night she grabbed her daughter and slipped out into the night. For quite a while after that, she lived in fear that he would find her and end her life, but it eventually began to appear he didn't care. So she moved in with her mother and felt safe enough to let her hair down. I noticed from time to time she would get phone calls or texts that would upset her, but I chose not to pry. It was about 9 months before I could no longer fight my heart and did what I'd swore I'd never do. When on late-night inventory, I finally got the courage to ask her out. I probably spent a good 5 minutes getting to the point, and perhaps even longer assuring that she was in no way required to say yes for the safety of her job. When I'd finally run out of things to say and stopped talking, she simply answered yes, and that was how it started. Even though I'd done my best to keep it between the two of us, the other employees found out. To my surprise, most of them were happy to hear that I'd done it, and she said yes. The occasional pat on the back and word of encouragement made me wish I would have asked earlier. On our first date, we decided to keep work a professional environment, and that worked well. Things between us were going very well. We just went on a second date, and it looked like things were about to get much more serious. A couple of days after that date, we were scheduled to open the restaurant together, but she was running late, which was unheard of from her. I called her phone several times, but only got the answering machine. Then, about 15 minutes before opening, a male employee returned from the dumpster with a shocked look and no color in his face. That's how I found out that she was dead. Of course, the cops came and all of that. I'm unable to be super specific because I was in shock at the time. It wasn't until her body was taken away that I broke down in tears, and I stayed that way for some time. One of the managers from another store filled in for me for a few days until after the funeral. When I returned, nothing was as it used to be. There was a giant hole in the soul of the restaurant, and most of us walked around in a daze for a long time. The investigation is still active today, even 4 years later. Her boyfriend soon became the #1 suspect, and his actions soon after her death did him no favors. He fled into Mexico, and despite the law enforcement officers of 2 countries searching for him, he's still free. There's been multiple sightings over the years, and everyone still has hope he'll eventually be apprehended. Personally, I hope he tries to shoot it out with the police and they spray him with bullets, at least to start with. I often still have dreams where I see him on the street and I strangle him to death with my bare hands, but I know I'll never get the satisfaction. If he is ever caught and returned for trial, it'll make it my #1 goal to see him get the death penalty. However, after all those thoughts of revenge and punishment, I'm reminded of Sophia's kind and forgiving nature, and I think she wanted me to move on with my life and heal. That was one of the most amazing things about her. She could forgive and forget. Every time I'm reminded of this, I realize she was the finest of this world, and none of us were good enough to deserve her. I thank you all here for letting me vent and allowing me to share this story of an angel. Hold your loved ones close. We never know how long we may have with them. Unless you've been under a rock your whole life, I'm sure you've heard of multiple examples of crazy stuff being found in people's food at several of the fast food restaurants around the world. Being a former slop herder myself in my younger years, I could fill a book with all the tales of nastiness I've witnessed. But after a quick inventory of my memories, I've chosen an especially horrible and gory tale about one girl's split-second mistake and the circumstances that followed. I'll attempt to be brief with the lesser important details, but nonetheless, they are still important, so I must include them in the story. Fresh out of high school, I lacked any real qualifications, so I shuffled around the state of Michigan working low-paying jobs, hoping to find a place to settle down and start a family. In the early part of 2012, I ended up in Jackson, a relatively small city about 40 miles away from Lansing. Not planning to stay long, I took a job at a fast food place. Because of what you'll hear later, I'll leave out the name, but I will say they really like meat, and leave it at that. Things were soon going smoothly at work and in my personal life. I just met this 22-year-old chick with a young son, and we soon moved in together. I was beginning to believe that I'd finally found someone to settle down with. Unfortunately, the relationship would later fall apart, but at that time, I thought the restaurant may be a stepping stone to better things. I would often volunteer to work extra shifts, and soon my dedication paid off, and I was promoted to assistant manager. It was said no one had been promoted so quickly, so I worked my tail off to prove I deserved the job, and all was great, until one stupid girl screwed it all up. It was your average May morning in Michigan, and I was working as usual. I had no reason to believe my job would soon be at risk, and the store would soon be embroiled in a health-related scandal. At the time, I was in the back doing something, and I was notified that there was a very important phone call I needed to take. At first, I thought something was wrong with my girl, but when I picked it up and heard what it was about, my stomach hit the floor. Apparently, a kid had found a part of a finger in his roast beef sandwich, and he was currently at the health center getting blood tests. I did my best to speak calmly, but my first reaction was to stop serving until things were resolved, and that's just what I did once I hung up the phone. It took a moment, but the girl responsible finally admitted that she had cut off part of her finger while slicing roast beef and hadn't bothered to tell anybody. How in the world can you cut off the tip of your finger and continue to serve food as if nothing happened is a mystery to me, but that's exactly what she did. Needless to say, once the story got out, I was in some hot water. After I had sent her to the hospital to have her injury dealt with, I had to notify my bosses of the situation. Of course, they were livid, and I got the brunt of the venom for not noticing when one of my employees was injured. Rather than standing up for myself, I took it in the backside like a good company man. Eventually, everything was dealt with, and the health department allowed us to stay open. When the bosses heard that a civil suit may be in the works from the mother of the boy, I was basically assured that I would be let go. Thankfully, she decided against it, but when the media found out about it, I knew my days were numbered and turned in my resignation. It was possible, if I put my head down and was a good boy, I could have maybe been able to keep my job, but I certainly would have been demoted, and I worked too hard for that. The discussion with my girl when I came home was far from supportive. In her opinion, I should have let myself get fired instead of quitting. Even after I made it clear that quitting would look better on my resume than getting fired, she already dug her heels in, and logic could find no place in her head. I had already had to deal with enough crap. I didn't want to have to catch it at home. So later in the week, I moved into a motel. I knew since the media had already released the story, the chance of me finding a well-paying job in a small town, Jackson, was out of the question. So after spending the next 3 days on the phone, I finally found an opportunity working with my brother in the Texas oil fields. Drilling oil was out of my comfort zone, but Michigan was played out for me, so I took it. As far as any other information regarding the finger food, I only know what I've seen online, and that's very little. Perhaps I could have weathered the storm and held on to my job, since the press seemed to have little long-term interest in the story, but in hindsight, I guess I'm glad the whole mess happened. I've got a much higher paying job now, and despite it being hard on my body, it's satisfying. I've been here probably longer than any other place since I left school. It's looking like I truly found that place to settle down in. As far as the family part, I'm working on that. I've met a few girls, but no one that's marrying material. When I finally meet that one, I'll let you know. Life as a father has kept me too busy to share this story until now, but better late than never, I guess. This didn't actually happen to me or anyone I know. It was told to me by a friend of mine who used to carpool with myself and a few others back when I was a garbage man. Yes, I was indeed a garbage man, but that's another story for another time. If you all are nice to me, I may share it in the future, but that's not why we're here. Back to the point, I'll do my best to be as accurate as possible in relaying the story. Although I'm nowhere near the storyteller my pal is, I'm more confident that it can stand on its own in the drama department. Now, hopefully, that will be enough details so we can get to the story. The guy who told me this is Billy. At the time the story took place, he was working as a small independent pizza delivery place. Another driver working there was some dude everyone called Mac. One night, not long before Bill quit, he took a phone order from a customer that made him uncomfortable. He couldn't really specify anything that he had said that set off his alarm, but he still got a bad vibe from the guy, and he refused to deliver the order. This caused a bit of an uproar with management at first, but soon, Mac stepped up and volunteered to take the pizza. He claimed he had delivered to that address before, and although he was a little odd, the dude was no threat to anyone. Being more than happy to get the boss off his back, Bill let Mac take the order and whatever tips that may come with it. Once the pizza came out of the oven, Mac quickly boxed it up and took off to deliver. Here is where we'll have to rely on a lot of conjecture and clues accumulated at the scene, but from what they could piece together, this is what happened next. Mac made it to the address and delivered it like normal. Despite the light being out on the street, he went about his work per usual. After dropping off the pizza and getting paid for it, Mac returned to his car and was about to leave the scene when he was held up by one or more people. Even though all the cars had bold signs reading the drivers carried no more than $20, robberies were not out of the norm. It appears that he thought he could get away from the thief by driving away. However, the assailant managed to get one round off and struck Mac in the neck. The car only made it about 30 yards before it crashed into a light post. The medical examiner is fairly positive Mac was dead by the time the car crashed. To make things even worse, the thief must not have been deterred by the noise of a gunshot and the mere fact that he killed a man for about $21.58, because he ransacked the wrecked car and Mac's dead body for the money until he found it, and only then did he flee the scene. That's one cold-hearted man. Eventually, somebody must have called the cops, and they were the ones that contacted the restaurant. Bill did admit to me that even after these years later, he felt bad for not being the one to take the delivery, even though he's glad he wasn't the one to be killed. He feels as if he sent Mac off to die that night, but he acknowledges that Mac volunteered to take it. That fact still does little to allay the guilt he still feels. Mac's death was the final straw for him, and he quit a few days later. To his knowledge, he's almost positive that the killer was never caught. Not even after a week after Mac's death, his boss told him to take a delivery just 3 houses away from the one Mac had been killed in front of. This was it for him. The company had just lost one driver in that area, and now they were trying to send him back into that nightmare. At that moment, he realized that his boss was no different from the scumbag that had shot Mac. Their only care was for money, and he didn't want to be another sacrifice on the altar of greed. My name's Missy D, and some of you may know, I've worked my butt off to pay my way through college. I did have a small amount of cash put back, but it wasn't near enough to get me through a whole 4 years. So, the moment I arrived in the dorms, I hit the bricks on a search for employment. It wasn't long before I scored a job at a small Italian-style fast food dive just off of campus. The place was owned by 2 guys who we'll call Joe and Tony. They had come to the States as teenagers and worked various jobs until they had enough money saved to throw together and open the restaurant, even though they had the knowledge of Italian food and the look of 2 men from the boot. I believe they were actually Albanian by birth. Despite being very close friends, the 2 men were quite different from each other, and because of this, they would often butt heads. But the disagreements never grew violent. Tony was the fun one of the 2. Working with him was always enjoyable, and I did my best to make sure I was scheduled to work the same shifts with him. But school sometimes prevented this, and I was stuck working with Joe. He was almost the exact opposite of Tony. A shift didn't go by without him cursing out one of the employees, myself included. Half the time, you didn't even know what he was calling you because it was in a different language. But his body language said it all. I can't count the number of times I wanted to quit, but I knew I couldn't let my ego screw up my life, so I swallowed my anger and kept my head down. I didn't know it at the time, but things were already collapsing behind the scenes, and I wouldn't have that job for much longer anyways. About a week before Christmas break, I went in one evening and saw that both Joe and Tony were in the restaurant. This was unheard of in the 6 months that I've been working there, and I quickly noticed a heavy feeling in the air I didn't like. I clocked in as usual and went straight to work. The strangest thing was that Tony nor Joe was talking to anyone other than short questions and phrases. Although it was pleasant not to be yelled at by Joe, Tony's cold demeanor only served to make me even more uncomfortable. All of us did our best to do our job, and things were going well until around 9 that night. I'm not sure how it started, but Joe and Tony were standing at one of the sandwich stations speaking in Albanian. From their body language, I could see that it was one of their usual heated arguments, but instead of choosing to walk away as one of them often did, the argument grew more loud and aggressive. Even though we were doing our best to ignore the disagreement, we still had orders to fill, and we needed to be in the same area from time to time as them. They had been arguing back and forth for about 10 minutes when I had to go to the walk-in to get some olives. Upon my return from the cooler, my focus was diverted by a loud phrase yelled out by Tony. I could tell from his tone it was something bad, and it must have been, considering Joe's reaction to it. The whole time that they had been talking, Joe had been slicing sandwich toppings and waving his knife around with each word like a conductor's baton. However, when Tony said whatever he had, Joe's face went blank. For a second, he stood and stared with a look of disgust on his face. But then, in the blink of an eye, he plunged the chef's knife into Tony's chest. Naturally, I froze and didn't know what to do. A look of shock grew across Tony's face once he realized what had happened. He continued to stare at Joe for a few seconds before he said, "What have you done, Matt?" "No." Then he slumped to the ground like a bag of potatoes. Joe looked down at Tony as he bled out and continued to stare for a short moment. I didn't know if he knew I was standing behind them, so I did my best not to move. Another of the girls must have been coming from the front and witnessed the same thing. We stood still, looking at one another, trying not to draw Joe's attention. Her eyes were as big as saucers, and I imagined mine looked the same. I had no idea if he would come after the rest of us, and the sick feeling in my gut got worse and worse. Although I'm not sure how long this all lasted, it couldn't have been more than a minute. Looking up from Tony's bleeding body, Joe slowly turned towards us, and I saw the hurt look on his face. It seemed as if though he was about to speak, but he stopped himself. Then he briskly walked between the two of us and out the back door. The second the door slammed shut, we both ran to Tony. His eyes were starting to roll back in his head, and the pool of blood was growing larger and larger about a second. It wasn't until then I remembered I had my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and dialed 911. While I spoke to the dispatcher, the other employee gathered up a few towels and packed them around the knife to slow the bleeding. I quickly yelled to the girl running the register to lock the doors because there had been an accident and someone was badly hurt. After she did this, she ran to the back and began screeching when she saw Tony on the floor. The girl helping him on the floor told her to shut up, and she did, and she kept staring at him. The paramedics showed up in less than 5 minutes, and when they loaded Tony up, they said he was stable. We filled the police in on the history of Joe and Tony's relationship and the business. The two of us that had witnessed the stabbing gave a description of Joe, and they picked him up before we even left the restaurant. They said they found him walking on the other side of the road not a mile away. When they asked who he was, he confessed to the attack and began crying. Once that was taken care of, the waiting began. Day after day, we prayed for Tony's recovery, and after 2 days, he started to improve. But by the end of the week, he passed. It was said that when Joe heard the news, his wailing could be heard throughout the entire jail. Considering his obvious regret, the DA decided to charge Joe with second-degree murder. Joe took a plea deal and will be in prison for at least the next 15 years. Since this happened in 2005, he'll likely be getting out in the next few years. I briefly considered showing up for his parole hearing and arguing against it, but despite his nasty disposition, I know he regrets killing his best friend, and will have to live with that till the end of his days. So, I'll just leave it to fate to decide his future, just as it does for us all. For more bone-chilling narrative that will keep you at the edge of your seat, subscribe to my channel. By doing so, you'll gain access to a growing collection of real-life horror stories that will both captivate and energize your senses. Join the community of fellow enthusiasts, and together, let's explore the eerie unknown. Subscribe now, and prepare for more terror-tingly true tales that will leave you craving more.